All right, everyone, welcome back to Course of Action. I have author H.W. Brands with me today. How you doing, Bill?
Doing just fine. Glad to be back.
Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing the book with me. Your book that's out. By the time people hear this, it'll be out. America First, which is a deep dive look at World War II and kind of what we did coming out of that, and some of the tensions with Germany and allies, and it very much has a little bit to do with what's kind of going on today. But as we get started, tell me a little bit about you, so the viewers can kind of understand your background and who you are.
Okay, one thing I'd just like to make clear for listeners. So the book is called America First, and the subtitle is Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. And it's really not much about World War II per se, at least not about America's participation. It's all about the debate over whether the United States should get involved in the war. Now, this debate lasted roughly 2 years, from the outbreak of the war in Europe in September 1939 to Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And it was during this time that Americans were trying to decide, is this war our war, or should we stay out of it? So with just that. So you asked me sort of, my background. I'm a historian. I teach at the University of Texas. I've been teaching for nearly all my adult life. I started teaching first in high school, and then I taught in community colleges, and I've been teaching at the college level now since 1985 or so. And I've also been writing most of that time. And sort of got into this first through teaching, but I'd always liked to write when I was a student. And I always sort of enjoyed the process. I kind of liked the finished product. And so I had started thinking fairly early on in my teaching career about how I could combine this with writing. And it took me a while to kind of suss this out, but I discovered that if you get a job teaching at the college level, especially at a university, then doing research, and for a historian, writing is part of the job description. So when I first started to write, I was teaching at high school, and that's not part of the job description. You work all day, and then you try to fit the writing in whenever you can. But when you have a university job, as I've been lucky enough to have for these last three and a half decades, your teaching responsibilities are cut back precisely so you have time to write. So that's how I got to do what I'm doing today.
So let me ask you a little bit more about that. So they want you to write, whether it's articles, books, whatever. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So when you teach at a university, like the University of Texas where I teach now, or Texas A&M where I taught before, everybody on the faculty is expected to contribute to the advancement of knowledge, in addition to teaching to students, to conveying existing knowledge to students. And in physics, they do experiments. In chemistry, they discover new molecules. In medicine, they come up with new treatments and all this stuff. In history, what we do is we discover new information and new interpretations of events in the past. So that's sort of what the historian does as the historian. So that's part of the job description. In most of the sciences, many of the social sciences, what is typically the work product is an article. So you do research in physics, you do experiments, and then you write up the results of the experiments, and they get published in a journal like Science or Nature or something like that. History has its academic journals, but the coin of the realm for academic history is actually books. And so ideas might first originate in articles, but the idea is that these books are there to read. And one of the differences is that almost no people who aren't specialists in the field read the specialized scientific journals. But anybody can pick up a book. And that's one of the things that attracted me to history. In fact, I'll digress a little bit, but I had a longstanding interest in mathematics. And I got an advanced degree in mathematics and then went in history. And I was trying to decide what I should finally get a PhD in and what I should finally end up in. And at this point, I was in a PhD program in history at the University of Texas, but I was teaching mathematics at Austin Community College. And I had a friend, a colleague, who shared an office with me, and he was in the PhD program in mathematics. And I knew enough math to talk to him about his dissertation. I said, okay, so tell me how it's going. And he told me all about it. It took him a long time to sort of get into the detail of it. And then I said, when you finish this thing, tell me, and you best guess, how many people in the world are going to be able to read your thesis, your dissertation, with understanding? And he started counting on his fingers, you know. And when he started counting on his fingers, I thought, that's not the audience that I'm aiming for. I want an audience of all sorts of people. And that is one of the appeals, certainly to me, as a writer of history books. I write, at the beginning, I was essentially compelled, required, to write for the academic history specialists, because that's the way you get the job, that's the way you get tenure. But all along, I knew that I wanted to write for regular audiences, people who aren't history specialists, who don't teach history, but who have an interest in what went before. And so whenever I've been writing, I think about, okay, what am I saying on this page that is going to be interesting to a potential reader who's just interested in history, who likes the stories of history? Who's not particularly interested in the theories of history, just sort of what happened, why it happened, who were the people. And I set myself as a writer's task to, on every page, give the reader something that's going to make that reader turn the page. And then on the next page, give them something to make them turn the page, and they keep turning and turning until they get to the end.
So, what you kind of hit on it, you know, something that it's because it's nonfiction, so we're talking about history. What would you say to people who are a little bit more fiction fans, and like those stories? Why should they read America First?
Well, in the first place, I never tell anybody what they should do. I just tell my kids what they should do. But if you're not my kid, I don't tell you what you should do.
Fair.
I will tell people what they get from reading history, what they get from reading fiction, and I'll use the real life example of my mother and my father. My father was interested in the real world, and if he was going to devote 10 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours, however many hours to reading a book, at the end of the time, he wanted to know more about the real world as it actually was. So he read nonfiction, he read history, he read my books. And he was a wonderful reader because he was candid enough to tell me what he thought about them. Sometimes he'd say, that was really good, Billy. He always used to call me Billy. And sometimes he'd say, well, not your best. Okay. And that was worth hearing because he was the model reader that I was writing for. My mother, bless her soul, she tried to read my books. She claims to have finished at least one. I'm not going to say that my mom wasn't telling the truth, but I have my doubts. But my mother would always say, at the end of every time I wrote a book, she'd say, but Bill, when are you going to write a novel? And I would say, Mom, I write these books in a way, I try to write these books in a way that makes them as gripping as a novel. And people tell me pretty often, reads just like a novel. And if a reviewer said, reads like a novel, I would send my mom copies. Mom, it reads like a novel. But the advantage is it really happened. But my mom said, that's not an advantage at all. That's a disadvantage. Because when I pick up a book, I don't want to know more about the real world. I deal with the real world all the time. I want to be taken away from the real world. And that's the fundamental difference, as I perceive it, between people who like their stories true, they want to know more about the real world, and those who like them, I won't say false, but made up. They like to be taken away from the world. The extreme version of the made up stuff is things like fantasy and science fiction. You know it's not true, but if it's a coherent world, it really sticks together. And there's certainly a place for that. That's not my taste. That's why I don't write novels. I don't much read. No, I mean, I've read a lot of novels in my life, but that's not where my interest really lies. It's really more in line with my dad, who, when he invested time in something, he wanted to know more about the world as it actually was.
But you still want that gripping, thrilling feeling that you get from a fiction novel in what you read, because it's bringing the real world. You're getting more of the real world and what happened, what used to, or what had been, and now we're kind of leaning forward and speaking of your book, and we're in kind of the same kind of situation now that we were way back into what, the 1930s as we were coming out of this.
1930s and 1940s.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I had the idea to write this book, I realized that in American politics today, we have come almost full circle, or nearly full circle, to where we were back in the late 1930s and early 1940s, to the point where Americans are asking ourselves, what is the role of the United States in the world? Does the United States have a responsibility to keep order in countries far away? The United States tried to do this in Iraq, didn't work out. The United States tried to do it in Afghanistan, that didn't work. The United States had tried to do it in Vietnam, that didn't work either. But Americans still think, and there are good reasons for thinking this way, that what happens far away can have a big impact on the United States. And furthermore, that if people are suffering in other parts of the world and it's in the capacity of the United States to alleviate that suffering, then it is America's responsibility. And so the United States at the moment is deeply involved in Ukraine's war of defense against Russia. No troops have gone there yet, but we spent hundreds of billions of dollars on that. And so far, Americans have been willing to go along with it. But there's a rising tide, a growing group of Americans, sort of starting with the Republican nominee for president, former President Donald Trump, who have really questioned that commitment. And so in this particular election, the election of 2024, this question of what's the future of the United States in the world, it's being examined more closely than it has since the election of 1940. So my book begins in 1939, but it spans the election of 1940. And in that election, a big question was, should the United States go to war in Europe to defend Britain, to defend the other countries that are fighting, Germany and Italy and the Axis powers? And it was a big part of the debate in that campaign. And I started thinking about this book about 3 years ago, and I had a hunch that in the 2024 campaign, this would be an issue. So I think what Americans did, what they talked about, what they debated in 1940, has clear ramifications for what Americans are thinking about, what Americans are going to do in 2024. And I would add, this is really the first time since 1940 that this happened, because once the United States got into World War II, then they bought into, Franklin Roosevelt was the advocate of going to war and of taking on this global responsibility. Once Americans took that on, and when it went well in World War II, Americans thought, okay, we like this, let's keep doing it. And so President Joe Biden, in sending American money and getting Congress to send American money and weapons to Ukraine, is basically saying the same things that Franklin Roosevelt said in 1940. And when he said it in 1940, it was contested by Charles Lindbergh. So my book is about Franklin Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh was the spokesman for America First, the name of the America First Committee, which is the one that said we shouldn't get involved in the war. And of course, there's a resonance here because in his 2016 campaign for president, Donald Trump revived the slogan, America First. And he was making some of the arguments that Lindbergh was making in 1940. And I would just add one thing. So as the election got closer, this election, 2024, my publisher decided to move the publication date of the book up. It was originally going to be published in November, but I said, no, that's after the election. We want this book out during the election. So that's why they moved it up to September. The book's going to be released on September 24th.
Which is smart because, you want to capitalize on that because, and I think there's a lot of questions. Like I was in the military and I'm all for us going and fighting evil and making sure that innocent people don't suffer. And there's really innocent and really, really good people both in Iraq and Afghanistan. The citizens of both of those countries do not deserve the tyranny and oppression and violence that they're going up against every single day. But I also believe that, we shouldn't, a 20-year war, billions and trillions of dollars, I do think there's a point in time where we got to evaluate and look at it honestly, and instead of throwing money at Ukraine, why haven't we sat down at the table with, the two countries and said, okay, so I think there's a lot to evaluate, and I think, like you said, there's a lot of people on both sides today that are thinking very similarly to, what they were thinking back, in the 30s and 40s. Same thing. Do we get involved? How do we get involved? Do we just send money like we did with Ukraine and we don't actually go over there and get involved? Is that our level of involvement going forward? I think there's a lot of questions on that because we can't afford to be the world's police. I mean, we cannot afford it.
Yeah. So there's one difference between the debate in 1940 and what has passed for debates or discussions ever since regarding America's commitment of military force. And that is in 1940, the United States government still adhered to the constitutional requirement that wars be declared by Congress. That's what the Constitution says. Congress shall declare war. Not presidents, but Congress. And so the debate over what the United States should do took place before the United States got into the war. And so really by Pearl Harbor, it was clear that Roosevelt had won the argument. The United States was going to get involved. But ever since Roosevelt, we've gone to war, or this country has gone to war in Korea and in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And not one of those wars was declared by Congress. Presidents effectively committed the United States to war. In the case of Korea, North Korea invaded South Korea, and Harry Truman, without consulting Congress, just sent American troops in. And then, after the American troops were already fighting, then he asked Congress, well, now will you pay for it? Yeah. And Lyndon Johnson got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but in part by misleading Congress as to what was going on. And presidents understood that it's really difficult for Congress to say no after American troops have already been getting killed, because nobody wants to go to the parents of a killed soldier and say, your son's life was lost in vain. And so they understand that if they take the initiative, the United States can sort of go wherever it wants. And if Joe Biden had not said, we are going to defend Ukraine, the United States wouldn't have defended Ukraine. It was his decision. And people could debate, we can still debate whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, but it's really clear it was his decision. And he basically pulled Congress along. Now, Congress, including last fall, they really said, I'm not so sure about this.
Kicking and screaming.
Yeah, and this is why it's going to be an issue. It is an issue in this campaign. And, there's a reason that the Constitution says Congress shall declare war. Because they certainly didn't have the idea of sort of crowdsourcing. They didn't have the terminology. But the framers of the Constitution understood if you're going to ask the American people to go to war, you better ask them if there ought to be a war in the first place. Don't just say the country's at war now, go. No, they ought to have a choice in this. And up until, and including the election campaign of 1940, there were these serious debates ahead of time. Do we go in? And so when the United States went in after one of those debates, there was a whole lot more legitimacy to the decision because we, the American people, voted on it instead of a president sort of finagling our way in.
Do you think that is maybe because, and I'm asking you this from a historian's perspective, so I'm kind of asking out loud, do you think the shift in that is because of the rise of terrorism and the way violent attacks kind of just suddenly happen and it kind of goes, oh, we're at war. It's that you declared war against us as opposed to, well, I mean, I guess Pearl Harbor was kind of the same way. But do you think that there's been a shift like that? And that's the reason why we're so jumpy?
I'll expand it beyond terrorism. Originally, I mean, you could argue that this is the largest terroristic weapon, nuclear weapons, because the first war that the United States fought undeclared in this way was the Korean War. And the Korean War broke out only months after the Soviet Union had tested its atom bomb. The United States, of course, had its atom bomb, tested it in 1945, and used it against Japan. And there was an understanding that in the atomic age, and then we'll call it the nuclear age, a war really can begin and end before Congress, if it's not in session, can gather to talk about it. And people pointed out, quite understandably and quite accurately, that when the Constitution was written, wars took months to build up to and actually get underway. And so if Congress isn't around, you can call a special session, and congressmen could take a week, 2 weeks to arrive in Washington, and they'd debate it, and nothing would be lost in the meantime. But in the age of nuclear weapons, of intercontinental bombers, and then rockets, that could be too long. Now, that's a partial reason. Mm-hmm. The other reason is more political, and that is when Harry Truman did it, pulled it off, Congress didn't yank him back, didn't pull American troops out. Other potential presidents said, well, if Truman can do it, I can do it. And so Lyndon Johnson, first actually John Kennedy, and then Lyndon Johnson committed the United States to combat in Vietnam, and only after the fact got around to asking for congressional approval. Not a declaration of war, because the war was already being fought, but the Gulf of Tonkin resolution said the United States can use force. And there have been these similar use of force resolutions in subsequent conflicts. But presidents realized that Congress wasn't pulling back. And so they could go ahead and exercise initiative. And if you have the kind of ego that gets you into the White House, you always think you know better than other people. And so, if I think we ought to go to war, we ought to go to war, and off we go. And members of Congress also, one would have thought that they would jealously guard their power and say, presidents, you can't do that. But actually, they discovered that it lessened the downside risk to them because they let the president get the United States involved, and they go along with it. And if it turns bad, they blame it on the president. Yeah. So members of Congress didn't raise their hands at the end of the Vietnam War and say, I'm at fault for this. No, they blamed it on Lyndon Johnson. He led the United States in. And also I should add that members of Congress have not been held accountable for votes for or against war because there are over 500 of them. There's only one president. Mm-hmm. And so you can focus on the president. But I'll just add something else here. It started with this issue of war. So presidents basically grabbed control over war. But presidents during that same period, they grabbed control of almost everything. So presidents can effectively raise or lower tariffs. Mm-hmm. They can impose sanctions. They can do all this stuff. And Congress has allowed them to get away with it. And the fundamental problem with this, again, going back to what the framers of the Constitution reckoned is, if you get, in those days, if you have 150 smart guys, smart people, today if you have 500 plus, smart people elected by the voters, you're likely to make a better decision if you just have one person. Yeah. More heads is better than one, especially if the decision is going to ask the American people to pony up millions and billions and billions of dollars, send themselves, their sons, now their daughters, off to get killed. So, we do our best making decisions, but I think Congress was right in the first place on this one. On a big decision like war, it ought to be with the people's representatives and not just one person.
Yeah, because I remember when 9/11 happened and, Bush basically said this was a declaration of war against the United States. And, I don't remember if he flat out said it or, I know he said, those responsible are going to pay, and we were pretty much at war. And I remember hearing several congressmen who were kind of like, but should we? And people just absolutely roasted them because we were the most patriotic we've ever been on 9/12. Yeah. So if anybody questioned anything like, well, should we really go get in a full-on war and go hunt these guys down? People were like, are you insane? Yes. That's the peak. That was peak, America then because we were all
and
ready to put on the gloves.
That's a really interesting example because sending troops into Afghanistan, which is where the Al-Qaeda terrorists trained, that was basically a slam dunk. And George W. Bush was going to get that. But then, when he piggybacked on top of that, effectively, not a declaration per se, but war against Iraq, That was much more dubious. But again, it showed how this worked, because the president, the CIA, the people in the executive branch, they handed over what looked like this evidence that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction. And nobody on the outside could really get a good look at this. So members of Congress were pretty much forced to take the president's word for it. And I personally think that George W. Bush was simply mistaken. I don't think that he was deliberately lying to the American people, but of course, the troops went in and there were no weapons of mass destruction. So there was one where if Congress had insisted, we're going to hold hearings, we're going to bring people down here, show us what you got, and not just what you want us to see, but we can subpoena stuff. But they didn't. And they realized that the downside risk is greater than any upside benefit. Because if you get out there and you're the one who prevented the United States from invading Iraq, let's say, and then terrorists connected to Iraq bomb an American city, well, it's all over for you. You screwed this up. Mm-hmm. So anyhow.
So we got the 85th anniversary of World War II coming up here in September, as well as when your book launches, and the election coming up this year. 85 years since World War II. What is the significance of World War II in today's world when it comes to some of these conflicts?
So this is a very apt question for me to answer, because it's also one of the reasons that I wrote the book. I'm 85 years, 85 years away from the beginning of World War II, almost nobody in the United States alive today can remember the debate that went on leading up to America's entry into World War II. Maybe if you were a really precocious 5-year-old and you're in your 90s today, okay. But there just aren't very many people there. Most people were adults at the time, and they'd be over 100. And there aren't many people like that. And so I'm trying to recreate this moment in America's history for people in the present, because I do think that there are a lot of parallels. I would never be one to say that history teaches X, because history doesn't teach anything specific. Things that happen today are like things that happened in the past, but they're always somewhat different. And we never know whether the similarities or the differences are going to have the decisive effect. But if we can look back and see what the issues were that Lindbergh was debating Roosevelt about, and on Roosevelt's side, he was saying that the United States owes it to its vision of the world, owes it to democracy, to defend democracy wherever it is under attack. Okay? That's a plausible vision. Mm-hmm. And the United States has sort of been doing that ever since. Now, but Lindbergh pointed out at the time, Mr. President, you say we're going to defend democracy. Well, Britain, the number one country the United States was going to go defend, was a democracy in Britain, but it held the world's largest empire. And British India was not a democracy. British East Africa was not a democracy. So be careful in sort of slinging around that term democracy. And this is the case. Lyndon Johnson said American troops had to go into Vietnam to defend democracy. Well, the government of Vietnam, South Vietnam, was not a democracy. It was, in most cases, a military government. And so there are always approximations. There are concessions to reality that have to be made. And then there was the question of one of the things that Lindbergh pointed out. If we do this, then we're not going to be able to do that. Resources are finite. We can't do everything. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that maybe now more than ever, because the United States, President Biden, has committed the United States on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars to the defense of Ukraine. Okay? And then came the war in the Middle East with Israel against Hamas. And the United States has been providing billions of dollars more in aid. So the United States is sort of on the hook for 2 wars going on. And then there's a reasonable prospect that China is going to try to gain control of Taiwan. And the United States is sort of committed to defend Taiwan. Do Americans really want to be on the hook for these 3 wars? And if China should take this opportunity to invade Taiwan, does the United States simply have the resources to do all 3 at once? There was a time in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union had broken up, and Americans and some other people talked about the United States as this single hyperpower that can kind of do anything. Of course, turns out even the hyperpower couldn't defend itself against Al-Qaeda on 9/11. And so this new kind of warfare, this asymmetrical warfare, emerges. And so in real life, as opposed to sometimes campaign speeches, if you choose this, it means you can't do that. The United States, as everybody knows, has a historically high federal debt. And the payment of interest on that debt is higher than it's ever been. Mm-hmm. There's going to come a time before long when people are going to have to decide whether they want to continue to fund American military operations overseas fully or to fund Social Security fully. Now, in all the time between Pearl Harbor and really just about now, the United States has been operating in what you could call sort of an age of free security. Not that it didn't cost nothing, but that the American economy was sufficiently productive that the United States could have guns and butter both. So America didn't cut back spending in Vietnam because it looked like Social Security or Medicare was going to run out of money. But both of those very popular programs are running up against the edge of their resources. So there's going to come a time soon, if we haven't reached it already, when Americans are going to say, do we want to put more money toward Medicare and make sure that when I'm old and I need medical care, that we have it? Or are we going to try to continue keeping Ukraine out of the clutches of Russia? Especially if that's 5 years from now, 10 years from now. You mentioned the 20-year war in Afghanistan. 20 years is a long time.
It's a long time.
Fight a war and conclude that, it didn't work.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the American people are not going to have the patience of that with Ukraine.
No, and speaking of the debt and decisions, I'm looking at the Peter G. Peterson Foundation website right here on my phone, and it says the national debt today is $35.2 trillion. That's $104,500 per person to pay it off. That's I would say that's probably more than the average salary.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of money, and you bring up some good points, and it's funny how history tends to, kind of repeat itself in a similar way. You know this better than I do, but we're asking those questions today that people probably asked back then too, like where's my dollar going? Like, you're telling me that Social Security is running out. You're telling me that Medicare's not as funded as it should be, but you had $1 trillion to send over to this country and that country, and you're writing checks like they're blank, and now we're $35 trillion in debt. So I'm not saying I'm against those things. I'm not against helping out Ukraine and defending the innocent, especially against Putin, who just seems to be just hell-bent on going back to the old ways of being a Soviet and taking over the old USSR, and he just has... I don't agree with his ways of thinking, but I do think that there's a point in time where we're going, well, I go to the grocery store today and I spend $100 and I don't walk away with that much.
Right.
How did we have money to send to them? And I think it's a debate. It's a very difficult debate for people to have, because some people are against war, some people are for it, some people are against, building a border, wall, and there's a lot of debate going on.
Yeah. And, once again, I'll get back to the principle that in a democracy, these are the things that people, voters, members of Congress should be debating. And if we think that we ought to leave it up to whoever happens to occupy the White House, that's a recipe for, sometimes they'll make good decisions, but sometimes they'll make bad decisions. But in any event, if it's just that one person, then those decisions could be made by one president, but easily reversed by the next president. And so it seems pretty clear that if Donald Trump is elected in November, the United States will not be supporting Ukraine, certainly not to the extent that it has for the last 3 years. And most voters who go to the polls are not going to be thinking primarily about Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be thinking about inflation. They're going to be thinking about whether Donald Trump is somebody they can respect as president, whether Kamala Harris is ready for the job, whatever it might be. And foreign policy, and a particular decision in foreign policy, is going to be kind of an afterthought. Now, it's a big decision. It shouldn't be simply an afterthought. But the outcome of the presidential election is going to make that decision. If the United States had been having a full debate on this ahead of time, then it wouldn't be so likely that a vote for president would have such a dramatic effect on this aspect of foreign policy. That this is the system we got. So this is what we're dealing with.
Do you think that, like, over time, the political parties have changed so drastically that now we're almost in kind of a broken system, that because our lives seem to switch back and forth every couple of years, depending upon president and Congress? Do you see that volatility? Has that evolved, or has it just grown from what it used to be?
In some ways, the perception that things are worse than they used to be is overdrawn. It's exaggerated in the way that, I don't know if you remember this, but back in the 1980s, there seemed to be an epidemic of kidnappings. And on the side of milk cartons, they would have this little Johnny was kidnapped in Toledo, Ohio. And all of a sudden, oh my gosh, these kids are getting kidnapped. Well, they weren't getting kidnapped at any greater rate than they were before, but for some reason, this campaign of putting their faces on milk cartons made every kidnapping around the country visible to everybody in the country. Nowadays, with social media, sort of everybody has a megaphone. Mm-hmm. There's an instant connection. And with this sort of concept of going viral, anybody can start something that can basically take over that particular social medium. So, and I should add that the media that we have, the social media that we have, they reward the people with the loudest, most strident voices.
Yes.
So I would say that the American people are about where they've always been.
Okay.
But the people who shout the loudest, the people who vent the greatest outrage and the greatest sanctimony, they're the ones who get heard most often. Because, with the algorithms of social media, those are the posts that get repeated. And so if you go back to the 1790s, when American political parties began, the things that were said about George Washington, for heaven's sakes, the sainted George Washington, they made stuff that's being said about Donald Trump or Joe Biden seem pretty mild by comparisons. So, and I should add that two of the great political figures of the day had a duel, and one of them, Alexander Hamilton, was killed in the duel. That's when people, took this partisan stuff really seriously. Thank heavens
Yeah.
we haven't had any duels lately. Although we did, of course, have an assassination attempt against former President Trump.
I was just getting ready to ask you that. That is something that hasn't happened. Oh, when's the last time that's happened? I can't think of the date off the top of my head, but
Reagan was the last one who was wounded in an assassination attempt before this.
So there's a lot of people alive today that don't know that. They don't know that history. They don't know what it's like to have a president threatened like that so publicly. I know that throughout the years, there's been plenty of things that have been stopped by the Secret Service, CIA,
right.
FBI, that we don't know about. They don't make it public. That was public, and it had no other option. It was on TV. It was recorded. Other than President Bush getting the shoe thrown at him in that one press conference, that's like the most public I think we've seen a president in danger. What is, as a historian, like that was a scary event.
Yeah. Well, I will say this, that it is heartening that most Americans, a lot of Americans anyway, before the attempt on Trump's life, didn't have any recollection of this, because it meant that presidents had been spared these assassination attempts for a long time. Through American history, we've had presidents go down, one after the other. So Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, James Garfield in the 1880s, William McKinley in the early 1900s. Theodore Roosevelt was shot and nearly killed as a candidate in 1912. And Franklin Roosevelt was shot at, and the guy standing next to him, the mayor of Chicago, was killed just before he was inaugurated in 1932. Puerto Rican terrorists, nationalists, they took shots at Harry Truman. John Kennedy, of course, was assassinated. And Ronald Reagan was nearly killed in the assassination attempt. So the United States has this very unfortunate but very consistent history of violence against the highest levels of the government.
Do you think the volatility that's going on today and kind of the arguments that are having between people, is that at all? A lot of people compare it to like the next Civil War. Is that similar to the issues we had back then? Are we heading towards a fight amongst each other?
So anything that somebody might call a civil war today is not going to look at all like the Civil War of the 1860s. The Civil War in the 1860s was at a time when a state on its own, and in the space of 3 or 4 weeks, could put together a military force that could give the Army of the United States a good run for its money. And if you got several states together, then you could fight pretty much on equal terms. But the technology of warfare has changed so much that there's nothing the state of Texas or California, New York or Florida or Wyoming could do that would give it the slightest chance in an open battle against the Army of the United States. So what would happen is, I mentioned asymmetric warfare. So we would have something like this. If there is going to be such a thing, it would look like guerrilla action. And there would be cells of, call them the insurgents, who would attack members of the government, who might try to seize a police station here or an armory there, who would make life miserable, make life uncertain. They would be, in effect, domestic terrorists. And terrorists can sometimes get their way. There might be hostage takings. That's not out of the realm of possibility. So it wouldn't be the blue and the gray against each other in the Battle of Gettysburg and Pickett's Charge and all of that.
Yeah.
It would look more like, say the Philippine insurrection against the United States in the early 20th century, where Filipino nationalists who didn't like the Americans there, it would be like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, where by day, these are just ordinary people. And by night, they go out and they sabotage and they engage in raids and the like. So that's the way it would work. I just add one other thing, and that is that during the 1860s, you could get a civil war because the states that were aligned politically were adjacent geographically. So the southern states, most of the slave states, were leaving, and so they had a big chunk of the Union with them. But the states today are broken up. So there are liberal states on each coast, and in the middle, there's all this big conservative zone. I'll add one more thing, and that is, even in conservative states, the cities tend to be liberal. And so there's no convenient geographic divide the way there was in the 1860s. And I'll point out, the insurrection, the Civil War, the secession of the 1860s, didn't work. Even then, it had a much greater chance of success than anything would today, but it failed ultimately.
So what would you say to the average citizen about America First, and what you're talking about back then and kind of what it has today and why they should read the book?
So what I would say is that we learn more about the operation of the American system. We learn more about human nature. We learn sort of more about ourselves by exposing ourselves to the experiences of other people. The loner, the person who has no contact with the world, doesn't know much about other people. The more people you know, the more people you engage with, the greater understanding you have of what it means to be human. Well, we can do this in real time, personally, meeting new people. We can also do it meeting people who lived in ages before us. We can read about them. I know a whole lot more people than I ever could have met in person because of all the people that I've read about. There are things I know about George Washington that I don't know about anybody today. I've read most of George Washington's letters, so I'm reading over his shoulder all the time. My best friends, I don't read their letters. I don't read their emails except the ones they write to me. On the other hand, there's some things I don't know at all about George Washington. I don't know what his voice sounded like. I don't know what it was about his physical presence that caused people to follow him, that made him a leader. So you can really expand your understanding of the human condition and politics, democracy, American life as a subset of that by reading history. So that's my pitch.
I like it. I like it. It's been 45 minutes already. I feel like you are a deep wealth of knowledge. I feel like we could talk for hours. I appreciate you. I appreciate you keeping history alive because I do feel like that at times today is a forgotten subject. I think people forget where we've came from and some of those, like you're talking about the human condition, our morals, our values, our ethics, and what we came from and where we're at today, the maturation of that. I think people tend to have a negative outlook on things today and say we're not the same country and we've got all these YouTube stars and all this stuff, and it's just they don't look back and kind of come forward. So before I let you go, tell everybody where they can go to find out more about you. Do you have a website, social media that you're on?
I don't have a website, but I am on social media. I'm on Substack, hwbrands at substack.com. And they can get my books at Penguin Random House or at Amazon or any bookseller, including this book, America First, which will be released on September 24th.
Well, it's a very interesting book. I got to read some of it thanks to you and your publisher, and thank you for coming on here today and educating me and the audience. And it's interesting to hear. I did not know the America First part, how it came from the 30s and 40s, that election, and moved forward, and how the connection to Trump and how he kind of revitalized that. So that's very interesting. I really like that. And again, thank you for writing such an important book, because I think it's important, again, that we remember history.
Well, thanks for having me on, and keep up the good work.